Today I'm in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, talking with Paul George, who is the Associate Dean and Director of the Biddle Law Library and Associate Dean for Curriculum Development at the University of Pennsylvania. Paul, as is our custom in these interviews, could we begin by learning a little bit about what life was like when you were young and even today?
Oh, sure. First, thank you very much for talking with me and including me in this project.
Thank you.
I'm actually from a small town in east central Illinois, downstate Illinois. I think it's about a population of about 600. One of 4 children. My parents were school teachers, and we lived outside of Champaign-Urbana. So it was a sort of a different growing up. I mean, sort of like this farming town. But on the other hand, we're 12 miles away from a university.
You have a pretty substantial, excellent university right down the road.
Right. So I think I would research papers for high school English class. I would go in and use the university library. So, so on the other hand, I was, in a little town of 600 people where the business district was 1 block long, type of thing. So, other than that, I guess a standard family, I suppose. Music lessons and whatever.
Normal sorts of things.
Normal East Central Illinois family.
Era,
Yeah.
growing up.
Right.
Well, you went not just while you were in high school to do a little work at the libraries at the university. You ultimately went on to university education and law school and so on. Could you talk a little bit about some of that?
So I attended the University of Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign. That was sort of everyone's goal if you live in that area to go to that university.
Certainly an excellent school.
Yeah, I had a great time. I loved it as a university. It was like it was one of those, somehow it was defined what I always thought a university should be and everything. But majored in history. That was not a time to get a PhD in history, so I had to decide what to do. And so I really wanted to go to law school. Went to Duke University in North Carolina,
in Durham,
and really wanted to sort of become a legal aid lawyer, which is what I eventually did. So I went back to Champaign-Urbana and worked in the Legal Aid Foundation there for 7 years. Actually 3 or 4 years in Champaign-Urbana. Went to become the directing attorney in the Danville, Illinois office. There was a branch about 30 miles away. And I remember driving home. I thought, okay, I'm not going to buy a house. I was over there, drove over before I started working, and was driving home. It was President Reagan announced how he was going to dismantle the Legal Services Corporation, which of course funded my organization.
So you were during this.
So I called the realtor and said, we're not doing that anymore, and actually spent my 1 year as directing attorney dismantling the office as we were consolidating back.
That's got to have been tough, and that continues. I have a daughter who's when she graduated from law school went into legal aid as a civil litigator. And met her husband, in fact. They were in the same office. But she went through about 3 downsizings. And now she works for an insurance company. So I guess she's moved to the dark half.
But then I went back to the office in Champaign and continued there for another 2 or 3 years. But I think about the 6th year, I said I really thought I wanted to do something else. I wasn't enjoying as much as I would have thought I should enjoy it. But we always had interns from the law school. At the University of Illinois, and I really enjoyed working with them. So I thought, well, how could I combine my legal education with something else? I'll still do something with this law degree that I would like to do better. And the University of Illinois has a great library school program. So I went and got my library degree there. Making decisions, I think, thinking back, you think, how could I totally changed careers and gone back to school at that age?
That's one of my standard inquiries.
I'm not quite sure how I did it.
What attracted you to this field?
I really was. I probably didn't have the full amount of information on what we do as librarians. I just thought it was, I enjoyed research, I enjoyed working with students, and to me that was a good enough combination to take the jump and to become an academic law librarian. I had no idea how much time we spent with faculty and other type of issues, but it was just the perfect decision for me. I've never regretted it.
Well, that's good. It's my own story too. I mean, I knew a little more about it when I went in because I'd worked starting actually at 15 in a law library by chance for 1 week, the end of summer. I got the librarian needed some books thrown out, so the dean was our next door neighbor at the law school, and he got 4 of us in the neighborhood kids his son and 3 friends
Yeah.
to come in and do this, and that's where it started for me. But it's been
Yeah.
a pleasure
Yeah.
way to earn a living. I thought through the years I was active, and so I'm glad you've enjoyed it and continue to.
Right.
Yeah. Did anyone particular person play any kind of a role? Was Rick Searles at the
Rick Searles
university at the time?
he was the director of the library at the
Yeah.
University of Illinois then, but I really didn't know him well, so
Uh-huh.
no one really played a role in terms of, I mean, he advised me, so I actually got some advice to him, and at the time what actually happened was I was in library school. It was a sort of a good year for job opportunities, and I actually had a job offer, believe it or not, to be a librarian here at the University of Pennsylvania,
Oh.
and a job offer from University of Southern California. And I had never really had an interest in going to California. It wasn't really so. But I truly enjoyed my experience interviewing people there. But Rick Searles said, if you have a chance to work with Albert Breck, the decision's made, you go work with Albert Breck. Yeah. And so that was sort of the only advice someone gave me, but it was perfectly, absolutely 100% true.
Yeah. Well, they had something in common. Yeah, they both started out as law students at the University of Houston.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
With Al Coco as the law library director, and he basically was instrumental in recruiting both of them into our profession. Now, they're a little bit apart. Rick had left right when I came there as the assistant law librarian. Rick went up to get the library degree in Seattle from Marion Gallagher's program at the time, and Albert started as a first-year student after I'd been there years, so there's a gap between them, but they obviously got to know each other. So they have that in common, that connection to the University of Houston days. And Albert finished up, and then he went up to Marion Gallagher's program, so that's how he got into the field as well. Well, you've had some interesting positions over the years, but before we get into that, there's a follow-up to your life type question that I like to ask sometimes, and that is, do you have any particular hobbies or passions or other interests, maybe when you're outside of work?
Outside of work. Well, I live here in Center City, Philadelphia, which is a great place to live, and I suppose we go to a lot of concerts. It's a good music city, a lot of opportunities for that. Love to cook. So building a cookbook collection.
You don't look like you love to eat too much, but you must do it in moderation.
I like to follow food and restaurants, things like that.
Yeah.
New York's only an hour or so away on the train, and I actually don't go up all that often, but just was up this weekend to see a couple of plays. And so that's keeping me busy at the time.
Well, that sounds like a fascinating kind of thing. Now, your music, you go to concerts, any particular...
variety. And we use like classical music.
Classical? The Philadelphia Orchestra.
It's Philadelphia Orchestra.
Renowned. I get a lot of recordings of theirs. I never actually heard them live.
Yeah, and their chamber music variety of soloists and quartets and different things that come through this other organization that is great to hear.
Well, I have a sister and her husband who live near me in Olympia, Washington, and we go to Seattle Symphony concerts about 7 or 8 a year. We have subscription tickets, and so we drive up and make an evening of it, and it's a lot of fun. Wonderful music and great experience. The other night I was visiting a friend in Florida as part of this grand tour that's brought me here, among other places, to have some of these conversations. And we went to a jazz concert, which is a type of music I enjoy, but I don't get to hear it that often. But it was young people, high school age, and some of them were very talented. And the other thing was free.
Oh, good. That's always good.
Community event. So that was good. Yeah. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the positions you've had? So you started at the University of Southern California.
Right, as a reference librarian. And I was there 9 years. So I sort of was head of reference, and then I think I titled assistant director for public services or something like that. Working with Albert, and also then with Tori Trotta, Paulina Ronis, and Lena Williams. So I always think back, that was almost like my Camelot years of my career early on in the very beginning. We just were a group that really clicked together. Albert was a great brilliant director. I think that's the person I learned about library
He always
services.
impressed me as a very first-class
Yeah.
person in all the right senses
Yes,
of that term.
definitely.
Very confident in his role as
Yeah.
director, I'm sure. He was really good when he was just a student assistant.
Yes,
when I know him first.
Well, he knew service, and he also
Mhm.
knew, I think, set a standard of not just for the service, but also sort of the director's role in the law school. He sort of sat on like a dean's advisor.
Yeah.
The deans met. He was one of them.
That's a pattern he learned
Yeah.
watching Al Coco operate,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he got involved in
Yeah.
the wider picture.
Wide- correct.
And I think those of us who were proteges, Albert, I
Yeah.
know I did this, tended to follow that pattern in our careers. Yeah. So you were there 9 years?
9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then a position had opened up at Harvard Law School.
Okay.
It was a position that had been, I think, Marion Parker held it before me, and it was a new position that they had created. So she held it for about 2 years, and I was sort of the second person in it, of an associate director for public research services, I think is what they called it.
Mm-hmm.
Basically a head of public services, but over reference, international reference, access services, and the rare book collection. So about half the library. And Terry Martin was the director.
Terry was there.
Yeah.
I was wondering if Morris had been there for a while. If he was still there when you first went, but
No,
Morris
I think
Cohen, I think he'd gone down to Yale by then.
Yes, because I think Terry had been there since 1983, and I
Yeah.
arrived in 1994.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
wrong when Terry's first started.
I first got to know Terry when
Yeah.
he came as the director at Georgetown, but
Yeah.
I was across
Yeah.
town at America.
Oh, okay.
We got to know each
Yeah.
other.
So I'll tell you a story about Terry that I don't know if it has anything to do with this, but he edited the Law Library Lights, which is the newsletter of the BC chapter of the Law Librarian Society. And it was a period of time when Lights was how we announced the meetings. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have any of these other things. And so it was very time sensitive. It had to get out. And Terry'd be waiting for stuff from various authors and so on. So it was, it was not that he had a huge lead time. And it would go to a printing plant, and then when they were printed, we'd somebody have to go down and pick them up, editor usually, Terry, and then get them to a mailing place and get them mailed to everybody, and in the old-fashioned U.S. Postal Service type mail. Well, one time, a group of people who had some grievance had taken over a building across the street from this printer, and they were armed. So the police had the whole neighborhood closed off, and Terry couldn't go get those lights, and we were running into the time when the meeting was going to be a disaster because nobody would remember to come to it. And finally it was resolved, and he hurried right over and got them mailed out, and everything was saved. Only, I guess, in D.C. would that sort of thing. Hopefully only in D.C. would that happen. Not here in Philadelphia.
Oh, that was interesting. So you were at Harvard a while. And
8 years.
Sounds like you had a fairly diverse type of experience there.
Well, yeah, so I came from USC, which was extraordinary service and sort of a standard collection, to Harvard, which is vast, almost incomprehensible wealth of collection.
The goal we all used to say, maybe someday.
But had good experience for building services, and I think we they had not been teaching, involved in the research instruction for the first year, so we started that. And then the other great opportunity I had there was the renovation of Langdale Hall, which was, Langdale Hall is the main library building, and it was a gut renovation, so everything had to be moved out.
Wow.
Some of the books were sent off-site, some we actually rented this sort of warehouse-type space in East Cambridge, and set up about 150,000 volume library there.
Wow.
And the on-site library, I think, was maybe 30,000 volumes and 50 seats or whatever. And what was great about it, we just kept focusing on services. So at the end, I think faculty were sort of saying, this is what you do for us. You can renovate every year.
Well, it sounds
So
like
it
you were
worked.
successful. And I'm sure the building, after they installed air conditioning, I trust.
They had air conditioning before, but
because I was there
questionable.
years ago when I was in library
Yeah.
school for a short period for internship, and it wasn't air conditioned.
Yeah.
Langdell wasn't air conditioned in those days.
Maybe it wasn't, but it definitely had air conditioning afterwards.
A vast improvement, especially in the summer, I'm sure. Yeah. So you were there. Then you came here next to Biddle.
Correct. So
Biddle
I've been
Law
here
Library since
2002. Right.
Okay.
So this is sort of the, I guess, end of my 12th academic year.
Mhm.
Right.
Well, you don't sound like somebody who skips around and
Yeah.
job hops.
I've been around the country, but I stay for a while in one place.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us about your experiences perhaps here at the Biddle Library and what you're doing and you know, that sort of thing.
Well, it's been a great time. It's actually in some ways was a tiny bit of a homecoming because as it turned out, about 3 or 4 faculty members who were here when I came, I worked with at USC.
Mm-hmm.
And so I already knew several faculty members, and they had told me it really was in many ways sort of like USC in terms of a very collegial environment and supportive. So that was one thing that encouraged me to come here. But obviously we've seen a lot of changes in libraries in the last few years.
Yeah,
so
now Biddle is a pretty established library in the more traditional book sense.
It is, but
a good collection.
A good, strong historical collection, and plus some strong archive materials. The American Law Institute and starting a bankruptcy archive. It was never the huge library of Harvard, Yale, Columbia, or Michigan. But over the years, what we've done, what many libraries have done, is first reduce multiple copies, and then we've been even to the step ahead of people, I think, in terms of just reducing print copies if it's available on Westlaw and Lexis. We stopped teaching print research a few years ago because I think it was difficult to convince students to reason. They come back afterwards and want to know, after a summer job, and want to know more about the print. So we no longer get reporters in print, only a few state codes in print. And it's been, it's something we sort of say, well, can we really do this? And we did it, and it hasn't been a problem.
Well, you know, deans especially take the position that space is very expensive to maintain.
Yes,
Librarians are accused of not giving a darn about that, but in today's world, that's reality.
But what we have done is through NELCO, one of our consortiums, is we've given a huge portion of our state collection to a shared repository called Palm Print.
So you can get something back
we can
temporarily if you need it.
We can get something back, and it can actually be shared. It's that we're in sort of a pilot phase, a 3-year pilot, but it's about 60 libraries who are supporting this project. Basically trying to preserve an archive for everybody of at least one print copy of primary materials. And we're just sort of ending the first year, so we're still sort of developing the collection and recall processes. But that's been sort of a safety net to see how we can really survive without the print, but it hasn't really been a problem. Law reviews, for example, we're in an agreement with Georgetown and American for retrieving law reviews. Like we each buy 1/3 of what's in High Online.
Well, that seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, being retired and not being, well, I'm close to the State Law Library in Olympia, but they don't have a lot of the journals. And I'm an hour or more from Petty Hazelton's shop up at the University of Washington. And so I use Hein Online, I use Lexis Westlaw through the licenses in American U as a emeritus faculty I can. And I find almost everything I need is available on screen now, and very convenient.
Right. And even for the new things, for example, we're doing our institutional repository now, so we're putting up all of our journals online, the back issues, and we're sort of taking over, putting up the new ones, so things will be available pretty much immediately after being published. The other big change I think we've been seeing is our research instructions, so that's been, we've obviously have had the first year program, it keeps evolving every year, but the advanced classes for the upper level students in research has gone from I think about 20 people probably 4 years ago to this year. I think 2 classes we ended up with 99 or almost 100 people.
Sounds like they go out into the real world
for
the summer between academic years and discover that there's a deficit.
They see the importance of their professional skills. So that whole climate has changed. So constantly trying to reevaluate how to meet that demand is part of the
I understand
challenge.
that's a major thing in law schools today as to how the practice has been saying to the schools, get these people a little more practice ready.
Yeah.
And the schools have stuck somewhat reluctantly to the old ways of doing
Right.
things, but that must be
Yeah.
changing, and this would be part of it, I would think.
Yes, and there are a wide range of skills students need to have today, which beyond legal research, as well as our law firm technology skills. We have a program here at Penn called the Center of Professionalism, which is trying to get students to be aware of all these skills, whether it's just reading an Excel spreadsheet and how to manipulate it. So, and that's something the library's been involved in, just sort of thinking through that. So we're sort of not just sitting in our corner of the complex, but reaching out and participating in this sort of planning of other activities and programs for students.
Now, you say this sort of we here. You're involving some of your colleagues in the library with some of the teaching?
Right. So, so in terms of the teaching, there are several of us who teach the advanced classes, and we're going to have to expand that to make sure we can cover all the needs. Within the planning within the law school, again with the Center of Professionalism, every first-year student is in what we call a cohort of 14 students. They meet with administrative liaisons a few times a year to check on them, and several of the librarians serve in those cohort leader functions. So sort of serve roles outside what would have been a traditional role of a librarian, definitely when I started, or even just 10 years ago, I think.
That must add a nice dimension to the roles they play generally.
Yes, I mean, and it gives you another chance to sell the library. So you can sort of emphasize the, do you know your research program for the next memo type of thing.
Yeah, and maybe get some off-the-record feedback
Exactly.
that can help the library
Yes.
make adjustments here and there
Right,
to
yeah.
changing perceptions on needs.
And I think it's a thing that is always make sure the library is seen as visible.
Well, I think that's something I hear in many of these conversations is that the library needs to do, and many of them are doing a lot more sort of outreach. We used to be just there, and everybody knew we were there, and they came there. But it's apparently a changing world, especially with so much stuff available on digital, which you can access someplace else. If you want.
But you have to educate people how to use the digital. They don't quite realize that until they start doing it. So, or even promoting it. It's part of our blogs that we have for the Biddle blog is always promoting a particular database so that people realize there's more than just Westlaw or Lexis or maybe even now Bloomberg. But
I was talking with one of our firm colleagues a while back, and I don't remember if this was on camera. If it is, it's in her conversation. If not, it may have been off camera. But some partner came in and said, was questioning, why we needed this library. And they'd downsized, as many of the firm librarians had. But why do we need the library at all was sort of the question in light of, we have Westlaw and Lexis and all the other stuff. And she said, well, you got to realize that all of that information doesn't just arrive on your desk by magic. Somebody's got to know what it is, how to access it, how to contract to or have it available. That's all library. And the library is all around you. And he hadn't thought that through, but he accepted. He realized that the library is a whole composite of things. Perhaps it's very different than a room full of books only.
It's so much more complicated. I mean, before a book arrived, you treated all the books the same. This database is accessed through this password. This database is through an IP range. University changes the IP ranges. You got to go back and contact the vendor to change the IP range accessibility, and so it all varies. And you have to decide: are you buying this electronic book for one person that can download 20 pages, or are you buying it for multiple users who can download it? The questions have become far more complicated than it's on the internet.
And that's all part of being a library and providing the services that those who use you need. Very different. Well, you do a lot of things outside of your so-called day job, Paul. You are on committees, associations. You've served the AELL, the Association of American Law Schools, the American Bar Association, the New England Law Library Consortium, which you were president at one time, and other things. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps some of that work and maybe even why you thought it important to be part of it?
Well, I think my last lesson from some of this is to say no.
We never. Well, maybe I'm good at
Maybe
that, but the rest of you never are. You say yes all the time and take on interesting things.
I guess it was just back from my beginning training with Albert and everyone else at
Yeah.
USC is to be professionally active because you learn from it, you make connections, you learn from those connections. Sometimes you learn that you have a pretty good job and should stay where you are. Sometimes you learn a better way to do something. So that's sort of how I've been with my initial work back in Southern California with Scout. That was, I think, a great chapter to work with because it was one chapter I think I've experienced where we were actually working with, I knew court librarians and firm librarians, and we all worked together. The ABA work sort of just grew out of being a librarian. I think when I was a director, sort of working with them on different projects. Again, almost in some ways returning favors to friends. Dan Freeling was involved with them when I got involved.
Was the deputy executive director of that.
When they asked me to be involved in Bricks and Bytes, that grew to Scott Pagel preceded me on the ABA's accreditation committee. So sometimes your friends turn you in and you you end up with more work.
Well, you must have a reputation for doing something right.
Maybe, but
they don't want to suffer someone who's got to let the ball drop.
And then Nelco's been one that everyone I think sort of takes their turn in a way, sort of being president of it. It's a group
I
defined
think of
by
it as
your
that
library.
those are the folks up on the other side of the Hudson River, but you're down here in Philadelphia, but you're still part of it.
Yeah, several years ago, before I actually came to Penn asked to be part of the core members, and then since then Nelco's grown to be a national consortium. So,
it's been interesting to watch it develop. They weren't quite there when I was still
correct.
But we envied what we heard was going on up there a lot, and that was good. I can still remember when we thought we were on the leading edge when George Washington, Georgetown, Catholic, Howard, and American all got, and I think George Mason all got the same kind of online public access catalogs. And then we could interconnect them, so you could sit at one of our terminals and call up Georgetown or one of the other places to see about books. And we did it in those days. We all had Innopax, innovative interfaces, enterprises, whatever the company name is. And we did it by telephone. So you'd have to push the button, and then it would dial the other one, and you'd watch the screen until it connected, and then you could access it. And of course, when the internet came in and the speeds and so on, and capabilities, that became just something everybody did. We thought it was very cutting edge for a while. And I remember our librarians and putting together a study to try and justify that I could use to try and get more resources for books. We did a study of our collection versus some of the others, and we picked very carefully. Georgetown GW had much better collection, bigger. So we picked and compared how we measured up, and it worked too. I got some sizable amounts of resources to buy some of the books we didn't have. And over a period of years, so it began, we did another follow-up. And we measured up a lot more after that. So you've been involved in a lot of this work. You have any thoughts about, we sort of joke about the wrong person calls you up and you say yes and you shouldn't, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, it's important, and you've done a lot of it, so apparently you view it as beneficial.
Well, I view it as beneficial. Sometimes it just gives you a different perspective on things, but other challenges, you can always learn from something. So.
Well, you have your day job, and we just heard a little bit about your off day job, but you still are busy in terms of your own scholarship.
Not well. Michelle recently asked me to write something I have to get to, but I don't really. I would disagree that I have scholarship, I guess.
Well,
I've done a few
the world
things.
suggests that you have done
a few things, but I think I view myself more as an administrator who maybe has done some things as opposed to as a scholarly librarian. I mean, Dick Danner is a true scholar and a great library director, but I know there's sometimes a debate on that role. I was at a panel once, I forgot even what it was, but someone said, how do you convince your dean that you need to have 20% time for writing, being a scholar? And I thought, you're
Well,
asking the wrong
that's
person.
20% after 6 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah,
when
that
you're
was
at home. You have your computer.
I think our response was, you need to ask what your dean wants, and my dean wants an administrator, and I think that's who I am more than a scholar.
Well, and looking around at all the people that I know, we've known, I've known over the years, not a lot of them are scholar librarians.
Yeah.
Morris Cohen
Yeah.
would be one. You mentioned Dick Danner. I'd put Frank Hodak somewhat in that category, and a few others, but not an awful lot.
Yeah.
But yet we do communicate. We teach each other on programs, in some of our own journals and so on. And you've done some of that, I know.
Yes,
that.
yeah.
And that's, I think that's
Yeah.
more the ordinary way it's done.
Yeah, I've enjoyed doing programs and writing a few smaller things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's I think it contributes a great deal and gives people ideas.
Good. Well, we're sort of coming towards the end of today's conversation, Paul, but it's customary to ask if there's anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up.
I think I'm fine.
Well, I hear that occasionally. Good, maybe we've covered the waterfront.
What else would be? Well, I think I referred back to at the beginning of how Albert sort of was involved in the law school or wider, and I think I've continued that, I hope, with we sort of view ourselves at Penn as a smaller school and leanly staffed. I'm not so sure other people would agree, but if you sort of show interest in other areas and you can become involved, I think that's what I've done a little bit here.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned my title, I work with the curriculum. I think that's sort of an outgrowth of just being a good administrator, and combining a role of that as a library director is an unusual combination, but he seems to work well, and I think it helps.
Yeah, that
keeps
is
the library
Associate
visible.
Dean for Curriculum Development is not a title I picked up on. I mean, often it's Associate Dean for Library and Technology or some version of that, but you've got library and you've got curriculum development. Well, the comments that you made about the need of the profession, and in this case, the law school part of the profession, the teaching part of it, to evolve. And I think they're very genuine. I mean, I share every one of them from what I've heard and what I've observed. We've got to meet a little different set of needs now than we did some time before. And you can't just say to somebody, you've been teaching this way for 30 years, and with age-based retirement gone and tenure still around, you can keep it up another 30 if you can get to class.
I mean, we've just been looking at sort of our numbers of, for example, comparing a few years ago the number of faculty members we served and who we serve now. Well, it's not just the faculty, because now there's, when I came, there was a communications department of one person. Now it's a substantial sized department that is actively writing speeches and press releases, and well, they're getting their information from us.
Yeah.
So there's another department we're supporting. So as the library has sort of grown in ways you never would have thought of when I was back thinking libraries work with students only. So you're working.
Libraries were a bunch of books. A librarian at the desk,
right,
waiting for anybody to come along with questions.
Yes.
Well, they never really were quite to that, but they're certainly not today.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly been a pleasure talking with you this morning, and I want to thank you also for hosting us.
Well, thank you
I'm doing 4 of these conversations
thank you very much
here
for
today,
coming.
and it's a lot easier on me to come and set up the various things that are behind the cameras here, the lights and the wires and all that, in one place instead of running around and doing all that from scratch every time. So I very much appreciate it. And I want to thank you on my behalf, and also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and of course Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have the honor of putting together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf section of Hein Online. I want to thank you on all of our behalfs for being part of today's conversation.
Thank you for including me.
Okay, thank you, Paul.